You ever have something that's been in your family for generations? Something peaceful, natural, and just. Yours only to have someone with a clipboard and a power trip decide it's suddenly a threat. That's what happened to me. When the HOA, that lovely bunch decided my backyard creek was too dangerous for the neighborhood kids. Never mind the fact that no one had ever gotten hurt. No complaints, no issues. Until the new board president moved in 2 houses down. Out of nowhere, I got a notice taped to my door. Then another. Then a forced order: drain the creek or face fines. I tried reasoning with them. Explained it was a natural spring, part of the land itself, but they wouldn't hear it. Next thing I know, there's a crew out there, pumps going, draining water like it was some trash-filled pool. They left behind a cracked, muddy pit where wildlife used to gather and my kids used to skip rocks. It wasn't just water, they drained part of our peace. But here's the thing about messing with nature. It has a way of finding balance, and I had a plan. If they were so worried about water being a threat, maybe they should have looked a little closer at their own perfectly manicured lawns and fancy underground drainage systems. Turns out, nature doesn't like being forced. And when you redirect it just right, it has a way of ... overflowing. Let's just say the next HOA meeting had a soggy surprise no one saw coming. But before I get into how exactly I turned their precious cul-de-sac into a soggy mess of unintended karma, let me take you back to the moment I realized they weren't going to stop until they got what they wanted. Why, I knew I couldn't let them win without a fight. The creek had always been part of our land, flowing gently behind the house, fed by a natural spring that ran through the hilltop. My grandfather used to fish out there when he was a boy. My kids grew up chasing frogs and building tiny stick boats during the summer. It wasn't just water, it was history, a living piece of our home. So when the HOA called it a hazard to community safety, I was stunned. The trouble really started when Susan, the new HOA president, moved in. She was sharp-dressed, always smiling, but the kind of smile that never quite reached her eyes. At the first meeting I attended, she brought up neighborhood aesthetics and child protection measures, hinting that open water could pose a drowning risk. A few of the other board members nodded along, probably just trying to keep the peace. But I could already tell Susan wasn't just concerned, she wanted control. Soon, I started getting complaints. "Your backyard is attracting mosquitoes," one letter read. Another claimed kids might wander too close, unsupervised. But here's the kicker. There's a 6-foot fence around my property, with a locked gate. No one could wander anywhere unless they broke in. I kept quiet at first, hoping it would blow over. But when they drained the creek without my permission while I was at work saying they had emergency board approval, I knew this was personal. Something about it didn't sit right. I started digging through old HOA bylaws, property deeds, and even maps from the county office. That's when I discovered something strange. Half the board members' homes were sitting right near the runoff systems that connected directly to the nearby reservoir. Systems that were never designed to handle overflow if nature got redirected. And that's when a new idea started to form. Not revenge exactly, but balance and nature. Nature remembers. After the creek was drained, something shifted, not just in the land, but in me. The backyard felt lifeless, like the heart had been ripped out of it. My kids stopped going outside. The birds didn't come around like they used to. Even the air felt different. And the worst part? The HOA acted like they'd done us a favor. At the next meeting, Susan smiled that same cold smile and thanked me for complying with community safety measures. I didn't say a word. Not yet. I started spending my evenings walking the neighborhood, watching how water moved after sprinklers ran, or after it rained. I noticed how the runoff gathered near certain homes, especially the ones with those fancy green lawns, all fed by underground irrigation. A few of the board members had even installed French drains, quietly rerouting their own drainage into a shared system. But that system wasn't built for heavy flow. And with the natural outlet, the creek now dry and sealed up, there was only one place all that water could go when pressure built up. I wasn't the only one feeling the HOA's grip tighten. A neighbor down the street, Mark, told me they made him repaint his shutters because the color was off palette. Another, Clara, had been fined for having a non-regulation garden box that barely peeked over her fence. One by one, people were getting tired, but no one wanted to be the first to push back. That's when I knew this wasn't just about me or my creek anymore. It was about how far this HOA would go to micromanage every blade of grass in our lives. So I kept watching. I kept learning. And I started quietly reconnecting a few pieces of the old natural flow subtle shifts. Nothing drastic, it's just enough to remind the earth which way the water used to run. And the funny thing is, once you give nature a little help, it doesn't take much for it to remember the path. Over the next few weeks, I became something of a silent observer. Every time it rained, I'd take notes. I watched where the water pooled, how fast it moved, where it drained. The old creek bed might have been empty, but underground, nature hadn't forgotten. The soil still shifted with every storm, trying to pull the water back to its original path, and I just gave it a little nudge. I didn't touch anyone's property. I didn't need to. Most of the changes happened right under their noses, old runoff grates that hadn't been maintained. Clogged filters, a few loose connections in their own irrigation lines. The HOA had been so obsessed with appearances that they forgot about the basics. I wasn't sabotaging anything. I was just letting the water follow the easiest path. And that path wasn't what the HOA had planned. Then came the forecast. A solid week of rain, not just a drizzle storm fronts stacking up one after another. The kind of weather that tests the strength of every drain and culvert in the neighborhood. I knew this was it. I stayed up the night before, walking the edges of my fence line, double-checking the flow. The grass along the old creek bed had started turning green again, almost like it knew what was coming. The morning after the first downpour, I heard it shouting, doors slamming, the sound of wet shoes slapping pavement. I stepped out onto my back porch and saw the beginnings of it. Puddles forming where there used to be dry lawns, water backing up into flower beds. One of the board members was outside, trying to scoop water away from his garage with a snow shovel. It wasn't working. By the third day of rain, the streets at the end of the cul-de-sac looked more like shallow canals. The same HOA members who drained my creek were now dragging sandbags in front of their homes. And the worst of the storm hadn't even hit yet. By the fourth day, the whole neighborhood was in a panic. Driveways had turned into little streams. And the lowest homes, mostly the ones where the HOA board members lived, were starting to flood at the base. You'd think someone would have stopped to connect the dots. But no, they kept blaming excess rain, acting like this was some freak occurrence. I kept quiet, let the water speak. But just when I thought nature had said enough, the second twist came something even I hadn't seen coming. The county showed up. A white truck rolled in, with 2 inspectors from the Environmental Water Division. Apparently, someone, maybe a concerned neighbor or a sneaky board member, had reported illegal water flow alteration in the area. They were polite but firm, asking questions about the sudden change in drainage and backed-up stormwater systems. They took photos, measured runoff levels, checked underground pipe access points. And then they asked me something that made my stomach drop. Didn't there used to be a natural spring or creek here? Turns out, the creek wasn't just a piece of land history. It was registered on county records as a protected minor waterway, which meant that draining it without going through the right agencies wasn't just petty. It might have actually violated environmental codes. I told the inspectors everything, how the HOA drained it without permits, how I came home to find the creek dry, how no one gave me a say, they took notes. Lots of them. Suddenly, the HOA's problem wasn't just soggy lawns. It was the possibility of real consequences, fines, investigations, maybe even repairs that would cost more than any of their pet projects ever did. But here's where it got really tense. Susan found out I'd spoken to the inspectors. She showed up at my door, raincoat soaked, eyes sharp. No smile this time, just one line. "You don't know what you've started." Then she turned and walked away. After Susan's warning, things escalated fast. The inspectors came back 2 days later with county officials and documents in hand. They weren't just investigating now, they were enforcing. Turns out, draining the creek without approval had triggered multiple violations tied to land disturbance, improper stormwater management, and potential harm to local wildlife. The HOA was slapped with immediate stop orders and a hefty fine. And Susan? She tried to deflect blame, claiming it was a group decision. But the paper trail had her signature all over it. By then, the storms had passed, but the damage was done. 3 board members had water damage in their basements. One of them even had a sump pump blowout during the worst of it. A few angry homeowners, now facing cleanup bills, turned on the board at the next emergency meeting. I didn't say much, just sat in the back while they argued among themselves. For the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was the one. On trial then came the real twist. One of the county officials pulled me aside after the meeting. They'd reviewed the area's older land records and found something unexpected. Because the creek had existed long before the HOA was ever formed, and had been officially documented as a natural water feature, my property was actually under a different environmental classification, which meant the HOA never had any authority over it. Not only had they broken the laws, they'd overstepped their own rules. The cherry on top. The HOA was now required to restore the creek to its original flow, not just apologize, fix it. That included replanting native vegetation, repairing the slope, and ensuring future water runoff was properly managed. All on their dime, and as the board scrambled to coordinate repairs, Susan stepped down quietly, citing personal stress. But just before she left, she passed me in the parking lot, gave one final glare, and muttered, "This isn't over." I smiled, because while the water was flowing again, so was the truth. Over the next few months, things finally started to feel normal again. The construction crews came out, this time under county supervision, to rebuild the creek. They removed the blockages the HOA had put in, reshaped the banks, and laid down native plants to restore the ecosystem. Little by little, the water returned slow at first, then steady, like it remembered where it belonged. Birds came back. The frogs, too. My kids ran outside the first time they saw the stream bubbling again, just like it used to. The HOA, now under new leadership, took a much quieter tone. With Susan gone and several board members resigning, the community voted in more reasonable people, neighbors, who actually listened. The fines they'd issued to other homeowners for silly things, like garden boxes or shutter paint, were quietly dropped. People started talking again. You could feel the tension lift, like the neighborhood could finally breathe. Mark and Clara, who'd both been hit by the HOA's nonsense, thanked me more than once. Not because I had some grand plan, but because I stood up when no one else could. And honestly, I didn't want to fight. I just wanted respect for the land, for the past, and for the people who called this place home. Looking back, the HOA tried to control something they didn't understand. They saw nature as a problem to manage, not something to live alongside. But you can't just drain history and expect everything to stay dry forever. Sometimes nature pushes back. And when it does, it reminds everyone who really runs the flow. So yeah, They drained my creek over a so-called danger to children. But in the end, their own actions created the real danger, and all it took to fix it was letting the water run free again.